Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
What's wrong with America today? Maybe that's a little broad. Let's start with a little smaller issue. What's wrong with campaigning today? Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we might point a finger at what you're looking at right now, your television. We might point our fingers at some other things as well. Our panelists today are John Rouse, our executive producer and a member of the political science faculty at Ball State, Bruce Galehood from the history department at Ball State, Cecil Bohannon from Ball State University's economics department, and Steve Smith from criminal justice here at Ball State. John, television played a big part in this campaign, a big part. The candidates went to the television to deliver their message, at least the message they wanted people to hear in 30 and 60-second spots. It's been criticized, television's been criticized as being a medium in this campaign of sound bites and mud balls. Has television indeed changed the face of national campaigning forever?
Yeah, I think it has, but the thing we have to keep in mind is that the medium is the message. And television since 1952 has played a part in national politics. The second thing I would focus upon is that not only the fact that the medium is the message, television is a hot medium, but you have to be cool with a hot medium. So you look for people who are cool with a hot medium. And from that point of view, many people thought that Michael Dukakis would do very well because in the early 1970s, he had been the host, the moderator. So if you want to run for president in the next 15 years.
It's a natural.
he had been the moderator of a public affairs, a PBS television program. So I think television, first of all, is the medium. The medium is the message. You have to be cool on television, supposedly. And the second thing I would say is that television, in terms of commercial television, is paid television, advertising. So advertising is certainly a part of the whole process. So I would look at the medium and also advertising.
Are these just Democrats complaining because they lost the campaign or looking for an excuse, Bruce? Or is television really a problem?
Well, you mentioned 1952. I think really 1960 would be a date that you might look at as far as the presidential campaign. John Kennedy was obviously the first television candidate in that respect. He did so well on that first televised debate with Richard Nixon in 1960 in terms of appearance and presentation of issues, and gave the voters a look at a candidate who seemed to be on a par in terms of competence and qualifications with a more experienced rival in that respect, the rival being Richard Nixon at the time. So television took on a tremendous amount of importance from 1960, and after that, I was wondering when you mentioned mud bites and sound balls, Larry, if you were promoting your next book, but apparently
they have
not.
a great title.
That says it all. We've said this on the program on many different occasions, but what we're having in America, not necessarily in respect to just presidential campaigns, but we're seeing a whole new phenomenon about the business of politics. Politics is becoming an increasingly business-like phenomenon. Television is what you see. Television advertising is what you see as the final result of a business which is more and more relying upon computer-assisted research, both negative and positive as it relates to issues and candidates, direct mail techniques, analysis of focus groups, and that sort of thing. And as the quickest and, to a certain extent, the most cost-effective way of getting your message across, that's how you see television taking on a greater and greater degree of importance. Now, I think it's also important to note that with the 1976 campaign finance laws that went into effect, which put limitations on how much presidential campaigns or candidates could spend in a general election, I think in 76, Ford and Carter were both limited to something like a little bit less than $22 million apiece. And that's why you didn't see a lot of the ordinary paraphernalia that you normally associate with presidential campaigns. A lot of bumper stickers, a lot of hats, a lot of flags, a lot of buttons, all of those sorts of things that were the visible manifestations of organized political campaigns, grassroots style campaigning and everything like that. When you only had this amount of money that could be spent on a campaign, you were going to put it where you thought it could do the most good, and television became that outlet. You didn't spend money on, on these sorts of things because you couldn't afford it. You had to try to reach the most amount of voters. So you see that in '76. A lot of things have changed relative to campaign finance since then. But with Ronald Reagan, obviously, you have another good example of a television-style candidate. And I think the business of politics, with television sort of being at the end of that, being the device by which this message is channeled through, has become certainly a basic fact of American political life right now.
A business, Cecil?
Well, of course it's a business. I mean, when was politics not a business, is what I want to know. I mean, business and politics have always been interrelated. People in the business community have always interacted with politicians. Nothing really new about that. I'm sort of troubled by the whole discussion of, quote, the evils of television on the political process. And that I don't see anything as really different from what's gone on historically in the political process. It's just it's a different medium, and so what? I mean, we went from newspapers to radio, radio to television. I don't see how television has particularly detracted from the high level of discussion in the political process. I mean, it never was a very high level. If you look at the kinds of things that were going on in like the 1948 campaign, and look at the things Truman was saying about Dewey back in '48, or you look at what Wendell Willkie was going through in 1940 when he was campaigning, it's not at all evident to me that television has lowered the tenor of political discussion. There's not any particular reason to believe the tenor of political discussion is going to be very high, and all that's happening is that television's reflecting popular will.
Nobody said it had to be fair.
Right. Yeah.
No, I don't think anybody said it has to be fair, but the other thing I think that's important to note is we've changed the definition of what it takes to be an expert. Now because of television and because we can see things and hear things on 60 Minutes and this television show and this and the nightly news, in 25 seconds we can become an expert on this topic or that topic. We see a lot of crime on TV at night. All right, we know what cops do. We've all watched Hill Street Blues. We're experts on police behavior. We're experts on criminal behavior. We come away from that feeling like we know a lot more than we actually do. We play a lot with the myths.
Well, Steve, how's that different than yellow journalism or picking up a New York tabloid at the turn of the century?
Oh, I'm not sure it is
It's
any
not
different.
really.
Yeah.
Now, if you know, to make this as real for those of you who are listening or watching, let's see if I can remember what I'm going to say. So, in the sense that you have to be cool, and so as you talk on television, you got to remember what. First of all, Dan Quayle certainly is a product of television. And number two, in terms of television, there's nothing wrong with the medium. The issue is who controls the medium. Roger Ailes, who was the Bush campaign person, is not a politician. I mean, he's a television person. If you go back to the issue of nuclear warfare, you have an issue of do the technicians control the politicians or do the politicians control the technicians? And the issue is who's in charge of this political campaign? Is it Roger Ailes, the television expert, or is it George Bush, the politician? I think that's the issue.
Well, Bruce may be able to help me on this because I think the point can still be made. Who controlled Abraham Lincoln? Wasn't Abraham Lincoln a product of the media to a large measure? Wasn't Abraham Lincoln manipulated by lots of people that gave him the beard and did all that to make him appealing?
Well, Lincoln, first of all, the beard didn't appear until after he was elected. That's important to note, okay? The beard didn't appear until he came into the White House. He campaigned.
But still, there's a lot of hype and myth and things like that behind his election.
Let's put it this way. Lincoln allowed himself, I think, to be, his candidacy was one which was handled by others with some detachment from him.
Sure.
At the time. Now, maybe that's relevant today and maybe it's not. But let me get back to a point that you were making about the interrelationship between business and politics. Really what I was driving at was something a little different. And that is you have a burgeoning industry which is getting bigger and bigger and bigger in this country.
Called political consulting.
Called
Sure.
electioneering in its various phases. It's not just public relations and ads people. It's research people. It's fundraising specialists who really specialize in politics. I can remember back in 1974 and 1976 where a primary campaign around here for a seat in the U.S. Congress generally involved about the expenditure of around $30,000 to $40,000 a primary campaign. A general election campaign, maybe $150,000 to $200,000. We see all over the United States now where people are spending $1 million to get themselves into Congress. $8 million to get to keep a seat or to fight for a seat in the Senate. Governor's races are tremendously expensive. And so my point is simply that politics as a business, electioneering, campaigning as a business, is really a growth industry in America. We spent spring of 1987 in England, and we saw some of that same sort of kind of thing developing in the British general election campaign, where you have professional politicians as different from the organizers and the advisors to candidates that we looked at in the past. But all of these other people who are able to harness the technology of communication, specifically as it relates to politics. Well, and I think just the fact that these campaigns are becoming more and more expensive with each passing year, I think helps to bear that out.
Sure. But then isn't that saying that all that's happened is in the last 20 years or so there's been advances in telecommunication technology and also in research technology to identify test markets?
Or we
and all that's happening is the politicians are catching on to what the soap people do.
But you have people who are specializing in that,
sure.
And that's different.
Okay.
They really are specializing. That's their ambition in life, in many cases, is to catch on to a particular specialty as it relates to electioneering.
But again, I don't see the fundamental difference. All you have now is the high-tech Politico compared to the old ward
I'm
boss.
not disagreeing with that, Cecil. I mean, I
No,
think you're correct.
It's not a boss. It's not a boss. It's almost like a hired gun, a person who will work for a variety
sure. Okay.
for a variety of candidates, sometimes regardless of party.
Well,
and this would filter down. This would filter down into state races or races for mayors or that sort of thing. This person's good, and he's available to you at a price.
Sometimes even in spite of ideology. The guy that did the campaign of this political season was the rotating door of the inmates going through the Massachusetts prison system. The guy that did that ad was an advertising executive from, I think it was Wisconsin. He was a convicted felon, drinking and driving, had hit someone, had done his time on a work release program, going to prison at night and doing his job during the day. He is absolutely in favor of work release programs and furlough programs, thinks they are a very, very good idea. Yet he single-handedly created the ad. They found out about his work, incidentally, because of the work he had to do as part of his court order for Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. He did a number of ads for them. They liked his work. The Bush campaign hired him. And he did more damage to the furlough programs that we've got operating in this country than anything that's come down the pike in decades.
Yeah, he created more than an ad. He created an image that, in fact, this furlough program in Massachusetts, and as we've well found out, Texas has them and California has them, Indiana has
every state has them, and the federal government. In '87, there were 210,000 furloughs given. They were 98% effective, meaning that the guy did no crimes that we know of while he was out. The 2% that were viewed as failures, most of those were viewed because the guy didn't get back on time. They weren't escapes. They were simply the guy showed up 3 hours late because he just didn't want to come back to the prison. And the group that we have the greatest success with in terms of furloughs are killers. They're the ones that are least likely to do the crime again. We want to send out property offenders. We think property offenders are a better bet. They're the ones that are most likely to be recidivists. They're the ones most likely to show up back in the prisons. A one-time impulse killer is the safest person to put back on the street. But we now have states. Statistically, those are the facts. When we look at this group, they're the safest group to put back on the street.
But that truth had nothing to do with the image that George Bush wanted to project.
Absolutely. So we changed it. Okay. So we showed them coming in, and they spent 2 seconds in the Massachusetts prison system. And on the face of it, it's ludicrous. I mean, no one wants murderers and rapists and thieves and muggers back on the street. I mean, that's on the face of it, that's silly. Well, but that's the image that gets presented.
Well, that quick transmission of that image too, does that not go to our society of convenience? In fact, that's all people want. Give it to me in 30 seconds or 60 seconds. I don't want to listen to Mike Dukakis speak for 30 minutes or for 60 minutes. Give it to me. Television news, cover the campaign for me in 2 minutes. Give me your political ad in 30 seconds.
It's not just convenience. I mean, that's part of it. There's no question of that. We're a convenience-oriented society. We want our Twinkies quickly unwrapped, and we want to eat them in 5 minutes as compared to baking a cake. There's no question of that. But the whole nature of the political process, the whole nature of the democratic process, which implies an individual's vote usually not being crucial in a national election, doesn't give an individual a lot of incentive to spend a lot of time being very careful about who he votes for. So what does he fall back on? He falls back voting on the thing that hits him in the heart, the thing that hits him emotionally. The Republicans use crime as a demagogic issue to try to scare people into voting for their candidates. The Democrats use very simple economic propositions that are completely fallacious to try to scare people into voting for them.
for example. Well, you know,
but it's the democratic process. It's not anything with the medium, I'd argue.
I think in a way that television is a positive thing because it does create some sense of accountability. We can go back, say, even on this program, for example, 15 months ago we had Dan Quayle on this program. We can go back and look at that tape and see if he is saying the same thing that he said 15 months ago that he's saying now. So in a sense you have a sense of accountability in terms of television. Also, I think as we look at the people who did well, they were Evan Bayh did well in terms of television. John Mutz did not do so well. In a sense, Michael Dukakis was too cool. I mean, he was too cool on television. So it's a tricky kind of medium.
Explain to me how Dan Quayle's a product of television. He won 2 congressional campaigns in Indiana, 2 Senate campaigns in Indiana. Television had very little to do with it. Now, why is all of a sudden is he a product of television?
Dan Quayle has used his skills, just like any of us use our skills to get by. He has used his skills to get by, and his skills are charm and good looks. And so far, the skills of charm and good looks have helped Dan Quayle get by. And television seems to magnify those good looks and that charm. And so I think television has served him well.
That's why an ugly man could never be elected president of the United States now?
Not a luck, I guess. No, but
But ugly is like beauty.
the other thing about it, John, is can't you say Dan Quayle perhaps has been harmed by television because the good looks and the, all that have made him look like the dumb bunny, and that certainly hurt him. That certainly didn't help.
Question is, what more does Dan Quayle have besides good looks and charm? And can good looks and charm continue to get him through?
Well, I mean, my observation, maybe it's just an old truism, but politicians are rarely as bad or as good as they seem. They're never as dumb as they look, nor are they ever quite as brilliant as they look. And my suspicion is that holds for Dan Quayle, too.
Yeah, let me disagree with something that John said, about accountability. Politicians will say one thing to one group. They will say something else to another group. They'll say they'll have one position on taxes when they're talking before the Detroit Economic Club. They'll have another position when they walk across the street and talk to the UAW. Sometimes television is very good at catching people, in
Juxtaposed.
contradictions. Okay, no problem with that. But what I consider as a rather healthy development of the last few presidential campaigns is the televised debates. And they go for an hour and a half. 2, I think, probably is good enough. But with a group of journalists, a group of sometimes print journalists as well as television journalists who are able to ask kinds of questions and to provoke some degree of accountability on the basis of what candidates have said and what they meant. Mm-hmm. We really wouldn't have that kind of ability to assess our candidates without the television debates. And that seems to me to be a rather healthy phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And it was scored almost even. Dukakis was considered to be the winner of the first. Bush the second. Bush the second one. I'm trying to think of the margins, and the polls and everything like that. But those were healthy. I think those are very healthy, and people that don't watch those are missing out on the chance of getting informed on some pretty basic issues, because those are the issues that the journalists who are doing on the panel do try to focus on.
But again, my point is to come back to the following. Politics is not some great platonic discussion where people are going to get together and have some deep intellectual idea. That's not the way people
One
make
of the oldest laws about a
and
political
that's true.
campaign is that you don't use a political campaign to educate voters.
Right.
You appeal to the heart.
Right.
If you want to be successful, you don't use this as a chance to educate.
If I can get back to the heart in terms of the thing that people do feel about crime, and let me ask Steve his point. Steve, is crime a serious issue? I mean, it was raised by the Bush campaign, and the implication is that the Bush campaign is very concerned about crime. Is crime, in terms of a new kind of focus upon crime, is it a serious issue to society? Is it one that should be on the top of the
Well, I think you're asking 2 questions, John. Is it? I think clearly it is. Look at what sells soap these days. It's the murders and the rapes and the pillage and the burning on evening television. Prime time is filled with crime and criminal shows. Should it be, I think, is another issue. The crime rate in this country has not risen. We do not have a burgeoning crime problem. Our crime rate is higher than any other modern industrialized nation and has been for decades. It has changed very, very little over the past 20 years. And if anything, it has come down some. And the reason it's come down is because the baby boomers, that bubble in the population. I'm a baby boomer. I'm 42. I'm old. I'm slow. I'm not stealing purses anymore. I'm not doing those kind of things, all right? That we use, the crime-prone ages are the younger ages, and people mature out of crime. The crime rate's coming down. We have increased the prison population in Indiana by 300% since 1978. The crime rate in Indiana has gone down less than 3% during the same period. We hear the argument for more and more and more prisons. We have everyone, I think, pretty well convinced that that's what we need to do. But point in fact is that it is not cost effective.
So you're saying, in a sense, that if we have more prisons, we're going. A prison room, I think, costs between $15,000 and $25,000 per prisoner. So if that's the case, you got to build more prisons. That means you have to have more taxes. So
That's right.
if you're going to say, let's focus upon crime in terms of housing these criminals, let's pay more taxes so we can put them away.
The state of Indiana right now, the projections, unless something changes in the criminal code, by the year 2000, the state of Indiana will build 5 new prisons, and the staff and the equipment to put those together will cost the state of Indiana $650 million. 2/3 of $1 billion in new money. That's not counting the operating costs of those things, the $15,000 to $25,000 a year that you were talking about. That's just to build them and equip them and staff them between now and the year 2000. It's a decade.
Well, how much of the crime phenomenon, the crime issue, has centered around the drug issue? I mean, isn't that concomitant with the whole concern about crime?
Yeah, I think so.
Which is a fear that, it borders on, it's a family fear more than it is, actually, I'm going to get my head smashed in.
And a reasonably new fear.
It's reasonably new.
Well, I think that's right, except the thing that won votes this election was the fear of street crime, the fear of being hit in the head. Drugs aren't nice. We don't like them. We don't want them. We're worried about them. But at the same time, the big fear is street crime.
But isn't the street crime related to the drug crimes? The notion being that a lot of the inner city crime that you're finding with crack rings and things like that are centered around the use of these kinds of drugs.
Yeah, but I can control drugs because my kids don't do them anyway. It's the neighbor's kids. It's somebody else's kids.
But sure, but your kid's walking down the street and he gets his head bashed in because of a crack ring in the area.
Yeah.
And it's
that's different
the
issue.
quote drug epidemic unquote that is coupled with the crime issue that's really made it
That's
an
right.
issue.
But there has been no concomitant effect of the drug epidemic, and there are some people who would argue whether we have one of those or not.
Sure.
But there's no concomitant effect in terms of increasing violent crime. Violent crime's not going up.
Not only did we see the pretty face of Dan Quayle on national television, we saw the not-so-pretty face of Willie Horton on national television, a black man who committed murder and rape and was part of the furlough program in Massachusetts. Would Republicans have used that same campaign if Willie Horton had been a white man?
I mean, that's just like, well, if Richard Nixon had done so-and-so and so-and-so in 1960, he would have been president. And, if we talk about ifs for the rest of our lives, I don't know. But I think that Willie Horton did solidify George Bush's base in the South. Because race, I think, it's still a very important part of politics. I mean, after all, we are a racial society, so let's look at that issue. So in a sense, Willie Horton was more important than Dan Quayle because in a cynical kind of way, he solidified that base in the South in terms of the South has become this solid South. Not the solid Democratic South, but it's become the solid Republican South.
That is one place where the campaign really did seem to be at least subliminally nasty.
Hit the low road there.
Right. Dukakis certainly made that charge against Bush that the Republicans were resorting to racist tactics. Cecil mentioned the economic issue. You had the Republicans turning around and saying that what the Democrats were trying to do was inflame the hatreds of World War II relative to Japanese imports and things like that, and that was what they were really talking about protectionism. They were trying to inflame anti-foreign, anti-Asian
Look at
sentiment.
Evan Bayh.
And that was racist too.
Yeah. That's racist. Yeah.
Had it been
English
English,
racist against Japanese,
Right,
you better be racist against blacks. Fortunately for the Democrats, at least, the Japanese don't vote in the election, so the political backlash to that somewhat limited.
had it been Germany or England, would Democrats have used that issue? Were they fanning the flames of, what does race have to do with either, though? Did it have something to do with it? You say yes?
Yeah.
I think it intensifies it, certainly.
Sure.
You know, it makes it a
brings
much more
people-
effective campaign.
It brings
to
people
see
out to
this-
vote.
I mean, Japan bashing for Indiana workers is surely a more
Yeah,
effective way
that's
to
right.
obtain votes of blue-collar workers in Indiana on Evan Bayh's part than just to say, we don't want to have state subsidies for new corporations, which was the substance of the issue.
Yeah, it was interesting to me how the labor union supported Evan Bayh, and then they turned around and twisted that issue with the Japanese. You know, the labor unions don't have a great history in terms of being pro-black or being, you know, and anti-racist, how you want to say it. So it was interesting that they used that issue against the Republicans here locally, and of course the Japanese thing borders on being racist as well.
Will the 92 election be pretty much a mirror of what we've seen in 88 then? I mean, are we going to see a lot of negative campaigning?
The interesting thing to me about the negative campaigning is the way it filtered down even to state house races. It was almost guaranteed that if you picked up an ad and you looked at somebody in the newspaper and you saw the person's picture, that it really was a campaign or a campaign ad for his opponent. And it seemed to be, if you saw Bayh's face on television, you could assume that it was a campaign ad for much critical of Bayh and vice versa. Dukakis in the tank was a Bush ad and that sort of thing. You know, whether it's a permanent feature, I don't know. But it's certainly, people caught on very rapidly in this particular campaign, and it got down to a very, very low level of, I don't mean low level, a low level in terms of the races.
Well, even in the Razor, what Carmichael campaign. you
Yeah,
don't know.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah, well,
The truth about so-and-so.
I'll make a prediction that the next election, what we're going to see is we're going to see two issues. You're either a big spender, because you're spending all the money and raising the taxes to cover the crime issues and the prisons and the other things, or you're soft on crime. They worked. They work. Those issues work, and
Yeah,
you're going to see
in
people
terms of
divide
winning,
up.
that's what you're
That's
saying.
right, and the name of the game's win. Sure.
Law and Order was a campaign issue in '68. It was a campaign issue in '72. Not so much in '76, but we saw it come back even stronger now.
Well, the deficit, certainly, the economy is always an issue.
Sure.
And if I'm better off now,
Yeah, well, one of the big issues is that, I mean, one of the points is there wasn't much you could do with the economy. I mean, you could do a little Japan bashing, you could do a little bit on the trade deficit, a little bit on the budget deficit, but there was no impending issue the Democrats could use, or particularly Republicans could use on the economy.
and nothing else
which
we
is
can
why
use,
it got diverted
we're out
from
of
the
time. John Rouse, Bruce Galehood, Cecil Bohannon, Steve Smith, thank you for being with us today. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for joining us.